I'm back with another The Gift of Fortune reading. So this time, we left off on chapter 2. So chapter 2 is called The Resilient Love. I began to plant the seeds for this new story arc. I still wasn't completely compliant with all of Jervis's ideas, but I chose to compromise. If I wanted to continue to help Laura, this was the path I had to take. Jervis wanted all of the characters in one spot, one location. I was unsure how I would make that happen, but rather than give in, I saw it as a challenge, an interesting one. I went back and forth over my thoughts, then it hit me. Rio Tobu. Rio Tobu was a beautiful and tropical island about 300 miles off the coast. Yes, I created it. It was the most complex still I had ever created. A still was just a term for the inanimate objects I formed. I originally intended it for Laura and I. It was supposed to be our island, a place where we could get away from it all. We could inhale the warm air, feel the endless sand of the beaches between our toes, and let the waves wash all of our worries away. I never actually finished the island. A lot of it remained more wilderness than anything. I stopped working on it after Laura became ill, but there was a single resort there. It wasn't particularly large, but I made sure it would take her breath away the moment she walked inside. It was just as beautiful as the island, and just as beautiful as she. It was about to serve as the setting for my new story. My gift had limits. I learned that very quickly, in fact. I could not create anything without having its specific purpose in mind when I formed it. It or they could not exist to do nothing. I also could not control anything I created with my gift, only manipulate their circumstances. One way for walkers was within their individual backgrounds, their origins. They thought, lived, and accounted for whatever memories I placed in their minds. This was possible in the first 2 stages of inception. There were 5 in total that I knew of. So I couldn't force them, but somehow I had to get 6 people on that island. 2 at a time began to creep in the back of my mind. It was worth trying, so I decided to start with Trent and Stephanie. Before that chapter, I must introduce each of these characters properly. Trent and Stephanie had been part of my story since the beginning. They were my go-to couple, you could say. It's only right that I start with them. At the time, the 2 were facing a very complex chapter in their storyline. Trent had been plagued by nightmares for nearly a year. Even before the hostile love storyline, he was a very troubled man. Stephanie tried her best to help him, but her efforts proved to be of no use. In all their time together, never had she felt so powerless. On an early morning, the light crept through the blinds of Trent and Stephanie's high-rise apartment. Trent jumped up instantly and sat there, trembling in fear. He wiped away the sweat, let out an agonizing sigh, and caused Stephanie to wake as well. Another nightmare. Trent often contemplated the true extent of these horrifying scenes that surrounded his subconscious, like planets around the sun. Trent wondered if they were simply unwanted thoughts, soon to pass, or manifestations of a foreseeable future. Trent was a former detective, an accolade that preceded him for his age of 26. Because of his young age, Trent walked among doubtful eyes and envious lips, waiting on his next mistake. Many of his co-workers didn't take kind to his stubbornness. His age only made this trait of his worse. Whenever he was given orders, you could bet Trent would have his own solution or approach to the situation. Which wasn't a big problem, but it did make it difficult for anyone to work with him. He never gained his colleagues' approval, nor their trust. Eventually, he was let go and had been jobless ever since. The nightmares he experienced didn't start happening until a few weeks after he was let go. He consistently returned to the bathroom mirror after every nightmare. He stared dismally at the image he reflected. His eyes were weak and his face was doleful. His hair that had once been as black as coal was now splashed with hints of gray. Anyone could see this was truly the face of a psychologically wary man. Stephanie was someone who brought stability in the midst of chaos, specifically Trent's chaos. She was a very patient woman and overall compassionate. Her level-headed attributes were the perfect balance to match Trent. Stephanie was a couple years older than he, at 28. Long, full, and flowing golden locks descended down her shoulders and narrowed at her lower back. On many occasions, Stephanie received compliments about her beautiful hair. Another physical trait I made sure to give her were her distinctive eyes. In the right light, her eyes radiated multiple shades of emerald. My mother had the same eyes. Those eyes were in torture, watching Trent suffer. One can say that she didn't have many worries of her own. With her successful career at her law firm, she was doing quite well without Trent's income. But Trent wasn't happy being jobless, even if they weren't financially inclined for him to have a job. Leaning over the bathroom sink, Trent ran cold water and allowed his mind to flow like the stream from the faucet. "Why do they keep coming?" he whispered to himself, watching the water fill the bowl of the sink. If I knew what these nightmares meant, maybe I wouldn't have them anymore. I guess the only way to do that is to see the therapist Stephanie keeps going on about. But who am I kidding? I don't think I'm willing to go that far yet. Then again, it's been so long since I had anything close to a good night's rest. I have to figure this out. Every evening Stephanie went to bed, she hoped to wake up to Trent smiling, telling her that the nightmares had finally ended. But for her, that day seemed to be an eternity away. Being a spectator to his misery never ceased to cause her great pain. Stephanie's concerns lifted her from the bed. She stared at Trent's defeated body language in the mirror. Small tears fell down the sides of her cheeks until they bled into the bed sheets. She buried her face in her palms as if she was holding back her emotions like a dam. Stephanie felt the touch of Trent's grasp on her hand. It pulled her attention to him. He sat just inches beside her. "I'm all right," he said softly. But his words held no resonance to her. These words in particular were rather familiar to her, so she looked away from him. "Seems you always say that these days. I wish you wouldn't just tell me what you think I want to hear. Be honest with me, Trent. Don't you think I deserve to know?" she pleaded. "Babe, they're just bad dreams. Everyone goes through them, right? I guess in my case, they just last a little longer. Honestly, I'm fine," he responded. Trent never felt the need to address what he actually saw in his nightmares, fearing the idea of bringing even more worries into Stephanie's life. But I've seen them countless times. Stephanie turned back to Trent and gave him a very fretful look. Understandably, she couldn't help but be curious about his dark horrors. Trent remained unwavering and insisted that he couldn't explain them if he wanted to. Stephanie reached out to Trent's face. With her hands gently pressed against his cheeks, she spoke intensely while gradually caressing his earlobes. "Hey, just because you are fine with all of this, doesn't mean I have to be. I get really worried about you, you know. Lately you've been so stressed about trying to find work, and I understand you're worried about me. And yes, you're right. I have been a little stressed lately, but I won't be looking for work anymore," Trent interrupted. Stephanie drew back. "What do you mean?" "Well, I was looking online yesterday, and I might be able to find some work down by the loading docks." "The loading docks?" Stephanie asked. "Yeah, the loading docks," Trent said, unsure. Trent became desperate and didn't have any luck at pursuing work as a detective. Not much was off the table, even working at the docks. The money wasn't bad, but not exactly worth the countless hours of labor. Many boats carrying thousands of pounds of freight delivered goods to the city and several regions surrounding it. Such an important job should have left a person feeling a sense of pride and fulfillment, but unfortunately, most workers were treated very poorly and often considered rather expendable. I continued to write on, waiting for Stephanie to build up the courage to connect the dots of my plan, to turn the gears. And just then, her look of worry turned to excitement. She was about to finally ask him. The sweat built up around my pen. It even caused the very ends of the letters I was writing to slant just ever so slightly. Well, I wasn't sure how I was going to tell you about these, but... She paused and revealed 2 plane tickets. So, what do you think about me and you going on a little vacation? Trent turned to Stephanie. What? He rebutted. You're serious? Yeah, I was at work and I saw this sign about a raffle for a free trip. I hadn't seen the sign before. They must have just put it up yesterday. So I put down both our names. And we won! I couldn't believe it. I mean, what are the odds? Stephanie read the tickets. It says free round trip to Rio Tobu? Rio Tobu? And where is that exactly? Trent questioned. Well, I never heard of the place, but Rio Tobu sounds beautiful and exotic. I've even got a pamphlet. I think it could be really nice for us. I don't know about this, Steph. It's a bit odd that you just happened to win tickets to a weird island, don't you think? Well, yes, but you honestly aren't leaving me with many options. Maybe this was meant to happen. Your stubbornness can be so annoying sometimes. Perhaps I'm getting help from some outside source, Stephanie explained. Like a deity? You know I don't believe in that stuff, hon. I know, but for once, try another way other than your own, Stephanie advised. Trent didn't find offense in her words. He looked to her hopeful face, then the tickets. He only meant to glance, but before long, he found himself unable to look away. He then began to feel cold, and an immediate overwhelming sense of fear took over. That fear rapidly escalated as he watched the tickets in her hands move and sway from left to right. It wasn't just the tickets. Everything around him was morphing into a blur until a strange vortex of glowing and intertwined colors appeared out of the tickets. Purples, greens, and powerful blues all burst majestically from a single point. Trying to comprehend what was happening before his eyes, he reached out to grab them. He grew colder, and almost instantly after grabbing a hold of the tickets, the swirling individual colors he once saw blended into one. The mix darkened, painting a scene from within the deepest parts of his nightmares. The scene flashed through his mind. A faint yet familiar voice called his name. Trent? Stephanie's firm grip on his hand brought him back from the nightmare. He was sweating profusely. The nightmares were becoming worse. Never had he experienced a moment like this. It was hard for him to discern between reality and the nightmares. They were integrating into one. Yet, Trent refused Stephanie's offer. My ideas weren't working. I was sure they would. Stephanie was completely on board, even if it was only to help Trent. He didn't feel the same way. I needed them both on the island. If Stephanie wasn't enough to persuade him, I had to find another way. Whenever Stephanie left for work, Trent spent hours looking for jobs at the computer. Less than a foot away, she often left the number to a therapy and counseling center, just a few miles from their home. Her efforts became desperate too, and she even offered to pay for therapy sessions. Naturally, Trent rejected. The next morning, while Stephanie was at work, Trent turned on the computer and proceeded to apply for a job at the loading docks. Before submitting his resume, he spotted a note Stephanie left with the therapist's number on it. He shook his head at it and went to throw it away until the colors and swirls he saw the other day began to return. He squeezed the note into a ball and closed his eyes. His forehead was covered in perspiration. His breathing was heavy and quick. It only took a few deep breaths to fend off the terror. He opened his hand and locked eyes on the phone number written in black and bold ink. Although I had no control over these terrors, I had to admit this one in particular was rather convenient. Maybe just once, he said under his breath. Later that day, Trent reluctantly attended his first scheduled therapy session. His mind was made up to tune out and not give much of an effort during the session. His hardened exterior was tough to crack. Inside, Trent was frantic and willing to try anything, at least once, just as I had hoped for. But he would not be receiving the help he expected from this session. Instead, I planned for something much more interesting. Refusing to tell Stephanie any details about the nightmares and confessing to a complete stranger felt wrong, so he didn't say much about them, which was fine by me. I didn't need him to, but he did mention Ryotobo. To him, going to Ryotobo meant that he was running from his own reality, the little bit that he still felt he had control over. This trip was something Trent just would not allow himself to do, so I provided the necessary push. He would go on to reject Stephanie's idea for several more days, until he came to realize his actions had no effect on reducing the night terrors. It wasn't until his second session in therapy he finally gave in. The night after the last session, Trent was dead set on not sleeping at all. He had hoped that this way he could avoid the nightmares entirely. He struggled to maintain consciousness for hours. Stephanie attempted to stay up with him as long as she could, but she could not hold on for very long and eventually fell asleep on his chest. Trent's eyes continued to get heavier and heavier. Before bed, Stephanie had placed the tickets on top of a wooden jewelry box that was on the nightstand. He looked over at the tickets, wondering if he would experience the same phenomenon as before. Nothing happened. Trent had one last thought before surrendering to his slumber. He smirked before reaching over to turn out the lamp on the nightstand, and just like that, 2 were down. Trent's stubbornness was rather difficult to get around, but I understood Trent like no other. There was only one thing that would get him to go. A job offering, of course. Not just any job offering, an investigation.